So all the people that I made happy in 2016 can now be mad at me. So I've made the entire American people in just two predictions really, really mad at me.
Warning. The political trade features probabilities and perspectives about politicians, political parties, political outcomes, and political wagering. The political trade is rated NSFP, not safe for partisans.
Welcome back to The Political Trade, the podcast for people with a passion for politics, probability, and profits. I'm Jeff Joseph, editorial director of Luckbox magazine, hosting the podcast where conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats, partisans and wingnuts come together to make money betting on politics by trading in the stock market for politics at predictive.org. Joining us on the show today is Allan Lichtman, a professor of history at the American University who holds the keys to the White House, his proven proprietary model for forecasting presidential elections. Lichtman isn't a prediction market trader, but if he were, he would have had a very profitable year in 2016. His model correctly called the election for Donald Trump against all odds. Up ahead, we'll discuss the model, how it works, its track record, its history, what it predicts for 2020, and how it compares to the prediction market forecasts on predictive.org. Lichtman's book, the 2020 edition of Predicting the Next President, The Keys to the White House, is available on Amazon. I'm joined by Mike Ruddy. Mike is an editor at Luckbox magazine, a new prediction market trader, and the producer of The Political Trade. Mike, how are you?
I'm doing good, Jeff. How are you?
I am good. Generally speaking, I'm very, very partial to Lichtman's model and approach. It's based upon the theory of pragmatic voting, that presidential elections are primarily a referendum on the performance of the party that's holding the White House. And of course, we've discussed the deficiencies of polling quite a bit on the podcast lately. And Lichtman's model, it's not a snapshot of voters' candidates' preferences on any given day. Rather, it's more of an indication of their larger move. It's a bit more qualitative, but I think it really adds a lot of value, and its track record does speak for itself.
I certainly think so. And, I'm familiar with the model, especially that it predicted the outcome of the 2016 election. And so if that doesn't speak for itself, I don't know what does. But I think we're really fortunate to have the opportunity to walk through each one of the 13 keys and really pick Lichtman's brain about what's going to happen in 2020.
And that's the plan. Let's do that. I want to walk through the 13 keys as well. Basically, I see it as an essential checklist. If you're a campaign manager in a major political campaign, using these 13 keys to say where you may be deficient in the perception of the voters seems like a prudent strategy. But we'll speak more to the professor about that. Let's bring him on. Allan, are you with us?
I am, and I'm happy to speak to you.
Well, Professor, it's nice to have you as well.
So fire away with your questions.
Let's do it. Before we get into your model and the 2020 forecast, generally speaking, I had a question for you. After the spanking that pollsters and forecasters took last year, how well do you think they've adapted? What have they learned from 2016?
They don't seem to have learned a darn thing as far as I can tell. We have Nate Silva out there with his phony probabilities, and you guys understand probability theory. So if you have a probability about a fair coin coming up heads or tails, it's based on underlying probability theory. But when Nate Silva tells you the probability of Biden winning is 71%, he revises it to 69%, it's poll driven. He's living and dying with the polls, and all of the conventional forecasters are still, and the pundits are still living and dying with the polls. I'm not saying they're going to be wrong. They may be right, but they're going to be right randomly by luck because, as you know, polls are not predictors. They're snapshots. They're snapshots that change over time, and the only way you can tell whether they change is taking another poll. Plus, they have to estimate likely voters, which is going to introduce error. So when they say their margin of error is plus and minus 3%, and that's on either side, it's not plus and minus 3%. That is pure statistical error. That's the error you would get if you drew red and green balls out of a jar of a million red and green balls. It doesn't take into account errors from estimating likely voters or errors from respondents not being candid to you. And I'm not against the polls, by the way. Pollsters are friends of mine. I am against the abuse of the polls as forecasters. And it's the laziest thing you can possibly do as a journalist. All of these innumerable stories on the polls. You don't even have to get out of bed in the morning as a journalist to write a story about the polls. And it serves the interests of the media because they can supposedly track the election day by day and have a basis for covering the election day by day. They can't just say, well, Lichtman's keys predict this, see you in 3 months.
Well, I think you've said more articulately, perhaps what I was trying to express at the outset is that your keys, your 13 keys, enables more of a qualitative assessment and offers a lot more insight into the overall perception that a voter might have. And basically, essentially that a vote is a referendum on the candidates, particularly where there's an incumbent. And I don't think that, polls really capture any of that, so we're thrilled to have you on. So let's find out a little bit more about how this all started. But first,
Yes,
tell us a little
sure.
bit more about yourself, your own background, and how you came to develop this model.
I grew up in the tough streets of Brooklyn, New York, where I learned to fight and to run, and much preferred to run. So I was a mediocre runner in college, but I was one of those guys who actually got better as I got older. And I was an over the hill age group North American champion in the 3,000-meter steeplechase, a race designed for horses but run by people. And by the way, in 1981, when I was a distinguished visiting scholar at Caltech in Pasadena, I used that shtick about running a race designed for horses to get on a quiz show called Tic Tac Doe with Wink Martindale. And I was the big money winner of 1981, over $100,000, 40 years ago. That was a lot of money, won 4 cars. And
How many consecutive days were you on the show to rack up $100,000
I was on 4 weeks. How about that?
for 4 weeks? Oh.
4 weeks. Even had a fan club. Lots of fan clubs. Unfortunately, it was, very elderly ladies and junior high school girls. But it was still fun for a while to, kind of be a real celeb. But I was, going to be the Jewish doctor. Went to Brandeis University, majored in biology, took the med boards, was all set to go to medical school, hopefully Harvard. And then I realized three things: didn't like being around sick people, couldn't stand the sight of blood, and was really clumsy in the laboratory. Not good things for being a doctor. But I had really enjoyed some of the history classes I took. So, senior year at Brandeis, I went to the dean and I said, Dean, I'm dropping out of the pre med program. And his response was, Lichtman, you can't. You finished it. And at 19 years old, I said, wait a minute, it's my life. But he said, no one's done it before. And I said, I don't care. It's my life. And he said, what are you going to do instead? And I said, instead of going to medical school, I'm going to history grad school. The dean looked at me and he said, Lichtman, you're crazy, which is, of course, what my parents thought as well. I had to explain to them over the many years, it's just a different kind of doctor, but they never bought it. So I went to Harvard grad school in history, where I utilized my scientific background to be an expert in the very new field. It was just coming into play in the 1970s when I was at Harvard, in the new field of quantitative history, using mathematical methods to analyze historical data, which also led to another sidelight in my life. and that is I have been an expert witness, get this, in 100 or so civil rights cases.
Well, how did this model come to be? What was the catalyst for that?
I'd love to tell you the catalyst was my brilliant thinking, but if I were to tell you that, to quote the late, not so great Richard Nixon, that would be wrong. I developed the model at the same time I was on Tic Tac Dough in 1981 when I was at Caltech. I met Volodya Kailas-Borak, the world's leading authority in earthquake prediction, the head of the Institute of Pattern Recognition and Earthquake Prediction in Moscow, one of just a handful of scientists who are members of both the Soviet and the US National Academies of Science. And he said, we're going to collaborate. And being foresightful, of course, I said, no, we're not. Earthquakes may be a big thing here in Southern California, but I got to go back to American University in Washington, D.C. Nobody cares about earthquakes there. And he said, oh no, I've already solved earthquakes, right? What I really want to do is collaborate on elections. Get this. He was a member of the Soviet scientific delegation that came to Washington under President Kennedy in 1963 and negotiated the most important treaty in the history of the world, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, that stopped us from poisoning our atmosphere, our oceans, and our Earth. And he said, I fell in love with politics, and I always wanted to use earthquake prediction methods to predict elections, but I live in the Soviet Union. It's supreme leader or off with your head. But you're an expert in the American presidency. So we became the odd couple of political research. And our insight was to reconceptualize elections in earthquake, in geophysical terms, not as Carter versus Reagan or Republican versus Democrat or liberal versus conservative, but as stability. The White House party keeps the White House party, and earthquake, the White House party is turned out. And using that insight, we looked at every American presidential election from 1860 to 1980, from the horse and buggy days to the modern era. And based on my insight that you quite accurately pointed out, that the American electorate is pragmatic, it votes up or down on incumbent party performance. We came up with the 13 key factors that underlie presidential elections and our decision rule that if 6 or more go against the White House party, they lose. And my first prediction was in April 1982, in which I predicted Ronald Reagan's reelection in the midst of what was then the worst recession since the Great Depression.
So that's 1982 is the first prediction.
Correct.
Have you changed the 13 keys at all in any way since then?
Very good question. We made a small tweak initially before I made my prediction from 12 to 13 keys. We were still in process. I have not changed the 13 keys. I have changed the interpretation. When I first developed the model with Kailas-Borak, you had to go all the way back to 1888 to find a divergence between the popular vote and the winner, which of course is in the Electoral College. So I wasn't much worried about that. Then we got to 2000, right? And I predicted Al Gore would win the popular vote. But G.W. Bush wins the Electoral College by winning by 537 votes in Florida. However, I contend I wasn't wrong because the election was stolen in Florida, as I proved in my 2001 report to the distinguished United States Commission on Civil Rights, and as other scholars have proved, tens of thousands of votes by African Americans were either discarded or suppressed. So I came as close as you could. But this, alerted me to a problem. Wasn't an issue because the predictions were so clear in 4 and 8 and 12, but in 16, I simply called the winner, didn't deal with the popular vote at all. And you can imagine saying Donald Trump is going to be the next president did not make me popular in 90% Washington, D.C., 90% Democratic Washington, D.C. And of course, my 2020 prediction is the same, just a winner. And by the way, this divergence between the popular vote and the Electoral College is not only a conundrum for modelers, it's a much more serious problem for our democracy.
Well, the Electoral College is clearly the subject of an entire other discussion, not to mention an upcoming feature in Luckbox magazine as well, where we're taking a
Awesome.
deeper look at that. But to be clear, then at this point, your model is predicting the Electoral College winner.
The winner, period.
And as it stands right now, that means the Electoral College winner. So,
Yes. Let me make one other point. What's happened, and the reason we get this divergence and why it's not relevant to look at the popular vote anymore, is back in 2000, the Democrats could count on a little under 2 million popular votes from New York and California alone. That has now ballooned to 5 or so, even 6 million popular votes from those two states, which count for nothing, as you know, in the Electoral College. They could win those two states by 537 votes and still get all the Electoral College votes. There's not even a remotely comparable Republican state. So, in any close election, like 2016, the Democrats are going to win the popular vote. You don't need me to tell you that, but that doesn't mean they're going to win the presidency.
and to be clear, the model itself, because it's dealing with national mood, national issues, probably doesn't apply well on a local stage or even a state stage. But have you attempted to use the underlying keys to the model to forecast either balance of power shifts in the House or Senate, perhaps, or other?
I have. The House is way too complicated to apply a single model to, 535, 37 House seats is impossible. But I did develop the keys to the Senate many years ago. And it was pretty successful considering I had one set of questions, which were quite different, by the way, from the presidential keys, apply to all the 50 states. And I was at about 85 to 90% right. The problem was, what did everyone focus on? The ones I got wrong. So I decided this was not an exercise I wanted to continue to pursue. I also tried to do governors and never did come up with a model I was happy with. Very, very difficult to apply one set of questions to 50 gubernatorial elections.
So, to be clear, why our listeners should be paying attention to these keys is that they do have a track record. There's an asterisk next to 2000, which I
Of
think you've
course,
well explained.
everyone has an
But that's
asterisk next to 2000. Come on.
done right. We all have asterisks next to something, but
Yes.
without question, you can your track record clearly indicates that you have predicted the popular vote winner of every U.S. presidential election from 1984 to present,
And of course, in 2016, it was just the winner.
with the outright winner. Yes. Okay. All right. Well, let's move into these keys. I'm particularly interested in a number of them where I think there's some opportunity for discussion or a more qualitative assessment. And I've looked so carefully at your research, and like I said, I want to be clear. I'm coming from the perspective that I'm a fan of this because I think it does much more in assessing the mood of the voters and provides a lot more value for people who are trying to understand macro trends that are going to influence election outcomes. But I'm sure from time to time or in perpetuity, your model is questioned as to the extent that there is some qualitative as opposed to purely quantitative discretion or judgment that must be applied to the underlying 13 keys.
Can I speak to that?
Yes, please.
Let me
Yes.
speak to that because you're right. Some are clearly quantitative, like midterm election results, and some involve judgment. And when I first came out with the keys, I was blasted. Lichtman, you've committed the sin of subjectivity. You should be banished to the eighth circle of hell, said the political scientists and the professional forecasters. But I come at this as an historian. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a professional forecaster. And I kept telling people, historians make these kinds of judgments all the time. You can't reduce human behavior to pure numbers. These are not random judgments. They're based on how the keys were answered all the way back to 1860 and how the keys are defined in my book. You have a right to your opinion about these keys, but you don't have a right to answer these questions outside the parameters of the model. Well, it took about 10 to 15 years. And all of a sudden, the professional forecasting world realized, my goodness, purely, you know, quantitative models, they don't work. They can't even predict, the economy quarter by quarter. And a very successful prediction model is one that combines quantitative and judgmental factors like the keys. And all of a sudden, the keys were the hottest thing in forecasting. As I said, this took, about 15 years. I twice keynoted the International Forecasting Summit, a special edition of the forecasting magazine on practical forecasting was devoted to the keys. I published in all the leading forecasting journals. You'd think that would give me enough validation, but I still get blasted for, judgmental factors. People have short memories.
Well, let's, before we walk through the 13 keys, just remind us again how we're going to assess these. There's 13 keys. You're going to say true or false. And what are the rules behind that true or false designation?
So here are the rules. Every key is phrased in a way that an answer of true favors the reelection of the party holding the White House today, the Republicans and Trump, and an answer of false goes against them. And if 6 or more answers are false, then the party in power in the White House is a predicted loser. Any 6. It's purely nonlinear, and none of the keys are weighted.
All right, let's do it. The first I understand is party mandate. Can you explain?
Yeah, that's based on how well the party in power has done in the midterms. It's just pure, that one's purely quantitative. And obviously, that's false. The Republicans took a beating in the midterms. They didn't gain seats compared to the previous midterm. One false.
Okay. And next?
Next is the incumbent contest key. And clearly, Trump was uncontested. That was true. The incumbency key, he's the sitting president. That's true.
So that's a true. Let me ask a question. So how was it handled in 2016?
That was a false for the Democrats. It was an open seat. Open seats start you out as the incumbent party with a -1, one negative automatically. That's why open seats are harder to win than when the incumbent is running.
Okay, and the third key, the question is the incumbent party candidate the sitting president?
So that's true,
That's
obviously.
clearly true. Next key is third party.
No significant third party. They have to poll at 10% or more to turn that key. Jorgensen and the others. That's true.
That's true. How did you call that in 2016 with Gary Johnson and Jill Stein?
Gary Johnson in several polls was over 10%.
Okay. All right. So they were referenced. And let's see, we have Joe Jorgensen for the Libertarian Party. We have Howie Hawkins and for the Green Party and Kanye West, but it'd be hard to make the case that they currently represent any significant challenge.
Well, you don't have to make the case. This one is objective. They have to poll at 10% or more, and they're right around 2%.
Oh, they have to poll at 10% or more?
Yes.
I see. Okay. All right. So next would be short-term economy. The economy is not in recession during the campaign.
Well, it's of course phrased as the economy is not in recession. So that one is false. That's the second.
So that's a false. So let's talk about, and then of course the next one is long-term economy.
Another false.
And what is the specific underlying criteria for that?
Real growth has to be at least equal to that of the previous 2 terms. And let me comment on those 2 false keys.
Sure.
They weren't false until this year. That is, things were looking pretty good for Donald Trump. And then we got the pandemic and we got the terribly botched response to it, which made us, we're the richest country in the world. We're the most scientifically advanced country in the world. And the response was so botched that we are right up there in the worst responses to the pandemic, which led to a recession and sharply negative growth.
Is the criteria based on the pronouncements of the the National Bureau of Economic Research when they
Yes,
actually
yes,
declare. All right,
yes.
so this flipped over just in mid-June.
Yeah,
This just that's when the NBER declared this a recession. It's interesting because usually it takes about 9 months to a year to decide that we're in a recession, and in this case, they made the announcement in just about 3 months.
which is very unusual. I also wanted to see that we'd get two consecutive negative quarters, which is another way, which some economists define. And of course, the sec the second quarter was, a third negative on a year basis, on an annual basis.
So, is it fair to say that if you were making this model assessment back in April, prior to the June declaring a recession, that in light of what was by far the longest expansion in history, dating back to the 1850s, right? Um, but we did have a
Right.
U.S. economy that stopped growing in February, right, after an expansion that lasted about a decade. So, if you were making this assessment back in April, would these have both been? They both would have been true indicators. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It's a great question. That's why I've been being asked, continually, what's your prediction? And I kept saying, I haven't got a final prediction yet. But, whenever you want to put it, early this year or the end of next year, Trump was sailing along, winning both of these keys. But it turned rapidly in 2020. And the truth is, we have never seen such a dramatic and sudden reversal of fortune for a White House party in the history of the country.
Boy, I'm glad you make that point because it is so true, and I think it also underscores again the significance and predictive value of this model because the prediction markets clearly were favoring Trump back in February, March. There's no question about that. But as these two indicators, your two keys flipped over, so did his polling as well, and so did the general consensus on what the outcome of the next election will be. So I think it speaks well to the validity of those two criteria.
Thank you. And, the model is adaptable, which is why I resisted all calls to make a final prediction until I released it to the New York Times at the beginning of August.
Of the underlying keys that we've addressed thus far, have any others changed within the last 6 months?
Not the ones we've addressed thus far, but there is one other that has changed when we get to it.
Good.
Go
Please
ahead.
highlight that for us when we move on. So now we go to policy change, right? And that's the incumbent administration affects major changes in national policy. Is that true or false?
Clearly true. The tax cuts, the especially the executive orders on immigration and the environment have totally turned around the policies of the Obama administration. True.
And then the next model, or the next key number 8, is social unrest. The question is,
Yes,
there is no sustained social unrest during the period. You're saying yes, of course there is.
there is. And again, this happened just this year. Three keys. We're now down four. That's the third key to turn against Trump just in a few months. Remarkable. But the model captured it.
Key number 9 is scandal, that the incumbent administration is untainted by major scandal.
Obviously false. My favorite key is the scandal key. When I give talks about this, it's so much fun. And sadly, I hate, but you get my point, to talk about what happened with Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. But clearly, he has been hit with scandal. So that's 5.
So historically, how have you assessed this? Clinton, yes. Who else was
Andrew
tainted by
Johnson,
Andrew
Richard
Johnson?
Nixon, even though Richard Nixon was never impeached by the full House. He resigned before he was. Only 3 presidents have been impeached by the full House: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. And Donald Trump's impeachment was vastly more serious than Bill Clinton's, or certainly Bill Clinton's, covering up a private consensual affair as compared to trying to rig an election. Come on.
Although that's not what he was impeached for, trying to rig an election.
I think that's what he was impeached for. That was the essence of it,
The underlying
trying to
tone.
shake down the Ukrainian president.
Yeah,
To
I think you
promote.
could argue, as I'm sure many partisans would argue, that that scandal is in the eye of the beholder, and now considering the increased polarization of of the legislature, that there will always be scandals going forward, and that some of these were, perhaps fabricated by the opposition. I'm not conceding to that argument, because I would say, okay, if that's the case, then let's just look at how the administration handled the coronavirus response, and that alone would qualify, I think, as a scandal that would be front and center on voters' minds right now.
And there are so many other scandals. The corruption of the Department of Justice would qualify. We've never seen any level of corruption like this, even under Nixon, even under George W. Bush, whose attorney general had to resign for politicizing the Justice Department. This is way worse.
Yeah, we're probably about to see something come out of the Durham investigation that
Yeah,
would
against all the guidelines of the Justice Department, which says in proximity to an election, you're not supposed to come out with anything that could influence the election. Of course, William Barr twisted that to say you can't come out with anything on a candidate, but that's not what the guidelines say. I read them.
And that's okay, because your model would capture it anyways. So
It's already captured it. Let's move
that's
on.
right.
But
Let's move on.
That's 5.
Foreign military. Well, let's see. How is this read? The incumbent
No foreign military failure.
No foreign failure. Right.
And that's true.
Of course,
No Bay of Pigs, no 9/11. So that's a true. We're still at 5.
And what's next?
A major foreign or military success. I rate that as false. None of the big initiatives have succeeded. Not in Syria, not in Iran, not in Iraq, not in Afghanistan, and certainly not in North Korea, where things are worse as a result of Trump's diplomacy, although I don't count that as a major failure. I think they've been reading the keys, though. At least Jared Kushner has, because he's tried to push this UAE Israel treaty as a major success. And it's met with a huge collective yawn in the United States, for good reason, because the treaty is meaningless. It says, Israel will suspend annexations, which it had done anyway. And Netanyahu says, I can lift that suspension at any time. So I certainly don't count that as a major foreign policy success, although, they were pretty smart to try to hype this. I have to give them credit. So that's
well,
6.
I would say that this key is probably where you probably have most opposition on a subjective determination. I mean, so just to make the other case, you can cite a list of foreign policy achievements by the administration. Clearly, things like the assassination of Soleimani and the assassination of
99% of the American people couldn't give you his name.
Sure, all right, but let me go
Osama
through
bin
the list.
Laden was a household name.
Sure, but how about revising NAFTA to the USMCA
This
deal?
is not that subjective. It's not opinion. I have answered this question since 1860. And if you're going to count something as a failure or a success, it's got to be consistent with how I've answered the key in over 30 elections. These are high threshold keys. It has to be broadly recognized. It can't just be the opinions of the partisans on one side or the other. If I were to do that, I'd still split the keys, by the way. I'd still give him a failure and him a success. But that's not the way the system works. That's why, and this is very hard. I'm not being harsh to you, but just about everybody misunderstands this. These answers are not fair. Matters of opinion.
I think there's a simple explanation for that. It's your model, and you make the determination as to what the criteria are that flip something from true to false. But let me
You got it right.
On.
You're one of the few people who gets it right.
I get that completely. And so this pushback now is only based on the fact that it's a given. Your model makes a determination as to whether that's true or false. But I would say, just today on CNBC, I saw Tom Friedman basically praising the Israeli UAE deal, and he's the last person to give the president any kind of praise. John Bolton, of all people, has already come out in favor of it. UN Secretary General Guterres has. Biden called it a historic step. Today or yesterday was that first commercial flight from Israel into Dubai. And it was covered basically, only 3 presidents in U.S. history has gotten an Arab nation to establish ties with Israel. Of course, it was Carter initially with Egypt, and then again under Clinton. And
And I
essentially, this is
didn't count the Clinton one. I only,
and you didn't count the
again,
Clinton one, and that's the question I was getting to.
we got to stop this discussion
So
because
you
you're
are
giving me your
consistent in your
opinion.
application.
You're
That's
not
right. Yes,
doing it according to the keys.
that's right. Well, they're
I
your
just thought
keys.
you understood the keys, and now you're proving to me you don't. I don't get it. I don't get
I'm
it.
not challenging your keys. I'm challenging the interpretation of it. The Israeli UAE deal has been widely acclaimed to be a breakthrough, a huge deal. When you have Tom Friedman making that assessment, I think it's one of the reasons that would be that there's different ways to look at it.
Not in the context of my model.
I understand that, and I've already conceded that. I'm just telling you how others might interpret that particular criteria, and that remains the same. But let's move on. Admittedly, we can move on.
Please.
Okay, number 12 is the incumbent party candidate is charismatic or a national hero.
Right. I didn't give Trump the charismatic key against the Democrats in 2016, and I don't give him the charismatic key as the incumbent, and here's why. This is like, and we can agree to disagree about the foreign policy key, but again, I don't think you're truly and accurately representing my model, but that's fine.
I agree with that. It's your model, right?
Right. It's a very high
But go ahead,
threshold.
because that's another question too, and I've seen it called into question before with respect to your model.
Yes, that's correct.
On the charisma element, because
And I'm about to explain it.
Please. Yeah.
Like the foreign policy success and failure, it's a very high threshold key. As I define it, and as it's been answered since 1860, it's only been given to the once in a generation charismatic candidate who is broadly appealing, like Ronald Reagan, who brought in all of those Reagan Democrats. Trump is a great showman. He has flash, but he appeals to only a narrow segment of the electorate. His base is about 40%. He's never really gotten above the low 40% range on average. His strong approval rating is between 25 and 30%. More than 60% of the American people don't think he's honest and trustworthy and don't like him. You cannot give him the charisma key based on the standards, the high standards of my model.
And historically, who were the recipients of the charisma key?
Very few.
You mentioned Reagan.
Reagan, Franklin Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, William Jennings Bryan, Barack Obama in 2008, but not 2012, and John F. Kennedy. That's it.
Say more about the distinction between Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. Why did you rescind that?
This is, really interesting, and it's again a big point beyond the keys. One of the best books on the presidency was written by Lyndon Johnson's press secretary, Twilight of the Presidency, and he points out how presidents get caught in this bubble. They're surrounded by yes people. They're surrounded by the consultants and the handlers. They're worried about, losing popularity, and the freshness, the excitement that Barack Obama had in 2008 was gone in 2012. In fact, was gone during most of his presidency. And, we saw that in that first debate with Mitt Romney. Gone. I was astounded. So I only gave it to him in 2008 because the key is such a high threshold key. And he didn't have that same magic.
So, of course, I think it's Max Weber who originated the notion of a charismatic leader. And those who have criticized this key have made the mistake of applying the definition of a charismatic leader, which is really about engagement with your followers. That's how the term's been used politically before. But you're using it differently. You're saying it's engagement with the broader electorate and not specifically to your own followers.
That's correct.
That's fair to say.
Correct.
Because
broadly inspirational.
do you feel in any way that the enthusiasm gap offsets that. So in this case, right now, as of the latest data, you would have, let's see, Biden is at enthusiastic support is around 28%. No, it wasn't 28% in March. It's up to 48% today, but it's still at a wide deficit compared to Trump, which has about a 65% enthusiasm rating. So there's a 17-point deficit on enthusiasm for the candidate between Trump and Biden, but you don't think that the enthusiasm for the president from his supporters or his base is enough to qualify as a larger charismatic leader.
If the definition was strongly appealing to a narrow base, of course, but that's not the definition. I
Right.
think I've explained the definition.
Okay, so tally this up. So where are we?
Wait, one more. Never forget the 13th key.
Oh, the challenger.
Yes, and I don't give Biden that key, so I don't turn that key against Trump. Biden's a good guy, but he's not inspirational.
Sure. It appears you have a pretty high threshold here with just Obama, JFK, and FDR. That's and Reagan.
That's a very high threshold.
That is rarefied air up there.
Yes.
Yes. So what is our count? Where do we come in?
All right. So he loses the mandate key, both economic keys, the scandal key, the foreign policy success key, the social unrest key, and the incumbent charisma key. That is 7. One key more that is necessary to predict his defeat. So whereas I predicted Trump's win in 2016, I'm now predicting that he'll be the first American president since Bill Clinton beat George H.W. Bush in 1992 to lose a re-election bid. So all the people that I made happy in 2016 can now be mad at me. So I've made the entire American people in just 2 predictions really, really mad at me.
What keys are still open to change in the next 2 months?
Well, the only ones that I see are the foreign policy keys. You
really want to bring that topic up again?
No, well, I'm calmed down about it, and you and I seem to have gotten to a meeting of minds on it. A failure can come out of nowhere, right?
Sure.
Not who predicted 9/11 until it happened. So we live in a dangerous world. Who knows what could happen? And if they get 5 more Arab states to sign on to the UAE treaty, I might change my mind about it.
Well, it's interesting you raised that, because there were 2 additional Arab states, and they escape me right now, perhaps Qatar and Bahrain, I forget, but there were 2 at the signing of the ceremony, which imply that they would be next to come. They were there. Representatives of those governments were at the announcement of the UAE deal, so that might be an October surprise that Kushner has up his sleeve. Any other October
I agree
surprise?
With you.
Yeah. Anything else out there?
Yes. Yes. 2 things. 2 things keep me up at night, and these are much bigger than the keys. And by the way, one quick point. I am open-minded about the foreign policy success key. If this turns into be a much bigger deal, I'm open-minded to change it. But we have to wait and see. But that wouldn't change the prediction. It would just go from 7 to 6 and still a predicted loss. 2 things keep me up at night. Before I preface that, let me make a couple of quick points, if I may. One is I've been doing this for almost 40 years. I'm 73. And I still get butterflies in my stomach every time I do this. And the hardest thing about being a forecaster, it's not knowing history, although you got no history. It's not knowing math, although you got no math. It's not knowing politics, although you got no politics. It's keeping your own political preferences out of it. It may sound easy, but it's really hard. And going into this year, I've predicted 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans. That's as even hand as you can get in 9 predictions. If I were just to predict my political preferences, you wouldn't be talking to me. I'd be useless as a forecaster. That said, let me tell you what keeps me up at night. One is voter suppression. The Republican base is old white guys like me. Well, you can't create more old white guys. You can't make us live to be 150, although I wish you could. So, what you can do is restrict the voting of the rising Democratic base of young people and minorities. And Trump seems to be doing everything in his power to achieve that, demonizing and suing on mail in voting, which is an essential alternative in the midst of a pandemic, and totally messing up the post office, sending in his mega donor who has no post office experience, who claims all these things he's doing to slow down the post office or needed to cut costs. Well, he could have waited 3 months until the election was over. So that really worries me. They're also talking about sending 50,000 poll watchers. This is the old Operation Eagle Eye that goes all the way back to 1964 to intimidate minorities. It has me worried. The other thing is Russian intervention. The Russians are back. They've learned a lot in 4 years. They may be even stronger this time. And the Trump administration has just made us blind about it, not giving oral briefings anymore to Congress. And we know he's admitted it. He's doing it. Trump will again welcome and exploit any Russian intervention that he thinks will help him. Those two things can mess up any prediction, not just mine, but more importantly, they can mess up our democracy. And that's the two things that keep me awake at night, not, our agreement to disagree maybe on one of the keys.
Well, I would add that recent pronouncements from the Defense Department and some releases just within the last 4 days suggest that China is going to play an increasing role in election interference this year as well. So I think there's a lot to tally up on that side.
We haven't seen it the way we've seen the Russians. That may or may not be true.
Oh, that's right. No, the Russians, we have 2 decades of that. So we know they're out there. Absolutely. So I'm curious, just going back in history, as you recall from your prior applications of the model to previous general elections, who had the best score? What election and what candidates?
Teddy Roosevelt in 1904 against someone as expert and as brilliant and knowledgeable as you probably cannot tell me who Teddy Roosevelt's opponent was in 1904. The most unknown presidential candidate in his, and I'm not knocking you. Nobody can.
I cannot tell you.
A state judge from New York.
He was an Illinois
Parker.
guy, right?
Yes.
from Illinois, sure.
Yeah,
that's
New
exactly
York.
right. What about since you started tallying since 1984? Who's had the best?
Reagan in 84 only had 3 keys out against him, and Obama.
Well. So let's stop right there. And Reagan had, of course, a landslide victory in 84 at 58% of the popular vote and like 525 electoral votes, right?
Boy, you are smart. Can I tell you a story about me and Ronald Reagan?
Please.
So when I made my prediction in April of 82, in the midst of the recession, when Reagan's approval rating was really low, it caught someone's eye. I'm sitting in my office. This is 1982. And I get a call from a gentleman with a heavy Southern accent. And this name you will know immediately. He says, Professor Lichtman, this is Lee Atwater calling from the Ronald Reagan White House. We want you to come to the White House. And I said, really? I'm kind of friends with you. No. He says, no, we know who you are. I said, all right. So I go to the White House. And it turns out Lee is a history buff. And he wants to know about Harry Truman come from behind and Kennedy Nixon, and introduces me to everyone, including H.W. Bush. But he didn't bring me there to schmooze about history or introduce me to the vice president. At the end of the day, he looks me in the eye and he says, Professor Lichtman, what would happen if Ronald Reagan didn't run again in 1984? Perfectly reasonable question for a president, turned over 70. And I said, Mr. Atwater, I'm going to tell you straight. Right now, you're 3 keys down on my system. Sure win. But look what happens if Reagan doesn't run again. Obviously, you lose the incumbency key. You're going to lose the party contest key because Bush and Robertson and Kemp will fight like crazy. Probably Bush will win, but it'll be a big fight. And without the Gipper, you lose the incumbent charisma key. George Bush, charismatic? He's about as charismatic as a Passaic shopping center on a Sunday morning. Atwater then looks me in the eye, breathes a huge sigh of relief, and says, "Thank you so much, Professor Lichtman," and the rest is history. And by the way, although Lee Atwater and I are on opposite ends of this political spectrum, we became close friends after that. And I'm mentioned in his not his auto, but his biography. He died tragically young and recanted all of his dirty tricks.
Well, I think the Reagan's performance, both in the Electoral College and the popular vote in '84, is another historical validation of the keys, because if that had the highest score, it also had the highest margin of victory for a presidential candidate in the last several decades. What was another high score since 1984?
Obama in 2008 was a very high score. He only had, I think, 3 or 4 keys out against him, and a very low score was Jimmy Carter. Well, this I hadn't predict. This is before you're asking since the Republicans in 2008. In fact, I predicted that election at the beginning of 2006. And
you mean John McCain and Sarah Palin?
Yes, but I predicted it long before we knew who the nominees were. Early 2006, almost 3 years ahead of time, I became infamous for saying things are going so badly on the keys for the Bush administration that the Democrats could pick a name out of the phone book and elect that person president. And of course, that's kind of what they did. Who had ever heard of Barack Obama back then?
And any other special nuance of what was the tightest election in the last
2016
keys? 2016
and 2000.
So
2000 those were both
Bush
one
and
key
Gore.
elections. Yeah, those were both one key elections.
So again, and it's another manner in which historically the model is somewhat validated by the fact that where you had very close tallies in the keys, you had close election outcomes, and where you had overwhelming victories were consistent with high scores on the keys as well. Well, we get it, we understand, and we're going to take a really quick break right now, but just in a moment we're going to walk you into the trading pits, and it'll just be a brief take to get your assessment on a couple current markets that predict.
Let me just say one thing.
Please.
One thing quick. Despite my brief moment of pique, you do seem to understand the keys as well as anyone I've spoken to.
I like the keys. I'm a big fan of the keys. So I'm happy to hear that. I think I think everyone has a lot. If you care about trying to assess, what voters are actually thinking, as opposed to these snapshots that we talk about in polling, I think the keys are particularly valuable. And I think they have applications even into corporate branding world as well.
No question.
I'm sure you've been asked to develop similar models for perhaps product launches using the same type of, I can see those applications in the corporate world as well. So we are going to be right back in a moment, but first.
Want a little more luck in your life? Get Luckbox, the control freak's guide to life, money, and probability. Named the best new magazine of 2019. Luckbox is a must-read for side hustlers, gamblers, entrepreneurs, and active investors. Each issue features best bets from prediction market experts, as well as timely sports wagering, stocks, options, futures, and cryptocurrency trading ideas. You can buy Luckbox on newsstands, but with this special offer, listeners of the Political Trade can receive a 10-issue digital subscription absolutely free. Just visit getluckbox.com to receive the award-winning magazine right in your inbox. Don't rely on luck. Get Luckbox for free today. Learn more at getluckbox.com.
Well, welcome back to the Political Trade with our special guest, Professor Allan Lichtman. And to get the most out of this segment, our trading segment, open up predictit.org, click on the Markets tab, which is top left, follow along, and listeners, leave your political ideologies at the door. And remember, Professor, when we discuss a contract price on Predictit, it's synonymous with what the market is forecasting the probability of that specific outcome to be. So a contract that trades at 42 cents implies a 42% probability of that outcome. So let's get started. We only have two markets to look at because it's really a summary of your 13 keys. The first is who will win the 2020 US presidential election. That's the big market on predicted. 96 million shares have traded. And
Wow.
there's currently four candidates. Joe Biden at 57 cents, implying a 57% probability. Donald Trump is at 46 cents. Kamala Harris is at 5 and Hillary Clinton at 3, but that's a whole other conversation.
I see Hillary Clinton at 1 here.
Well, it's amazing that she's getting any trading action at all. But
Yeah.
the simple question, based on the 13 keys and decades of accuracy in predicting presidential outcomes, our question to you: who will win the 2020 U.S. presidential election?
Based on my system, it takes 6 or more keys to count out Donald Trump and the incumbent president. He's down 7 keys. So my prediction is Donald Trump loses, and ipso facto, Joe Biden wins, which seems consistent with your prediction models here on predictive. But I have a question for you, if I may.
Please.
They don't add to 100. Why is that?
They don't. Attribute that to market inefficiency, what a buy-sell market looks like. And it's also the opportunity that traders have. Whenever you see that variance of the underlying options exceeding 100, that means if you take the opposite side of those, the short side of those, there's free money on the table. Because if you essentially bought no's across the board, the no value exceeds 100, which
Yes,
means
it does.
Yes, you have an opportunity to make money just off that arbitrage alone. It's been a subject of a number of prior episodes we've done with some of our trader guests who get into those arbitrage strategies. But the short answer is it's indicative of the overall inefficiencies that exist in the market and some of the opportunistic pricing that's available for traders.
Excellent answer, but I'm a little proud of myself for picking that up the first time I looked at it.
Well, you should actually consider opening up an account if you haven't. By
I
the
should,
way,
yeah.
I'll tell you that right now. You might want to write this down. And for listeners, if you're not already trading on Predicted, we do have $20 for you. You could take advantage of the trades that are shared by our guests, as always, and by simply going to predicted.org/promo/TPT20, sign up. Deposit $20 and we'll match that first $20 you deposited. That's predicted.org/promo/TPT20. Deposit 20, you'll have 40 to trade with. It's that simple to sign up and trade along. Let's move on. Well, the next one is just a clarification of your model, and that is, will Donald Trump win the popular vote in 2020? 2 million shares have traded here. Currently, the yes shares are trading at 25 cents. The no's are at 75 cents. Will Donald Trump win the popular vote in 2020?
No. In fact, there is zero chance that a Democrat will win the Electoral College and a Republican will win the popular vote. It can happen the other way around because of the 5 to 6 million extra Democratic votes in Florida and California, but we cannot structurally get a situation where the Republican wins the popular vote but loses the Electoral College.
Well, when you say zero chance, that translates in the political trade terms to what we call a lockbox trade.
I would put it in what I call a lockbox.
That is a sure thing. So if trading at 75 cents, you have a lock trade on Donald Trump not winning the popular vote. That's a pretty nice payout, paying at 70.
Well, that presumes, of course, that Donald Trump loses the Electoral College. Then it depends
this
upon
question
my
is specific.
first
Right.
prediction being right. Obviously,
That's right.
Yeah,
Understood.
it's not a lock universally.
Well, I don't see this occurring, as you've already addressed this question. But if for any reason in the coming weeks ahead, there's any shift in your model, we're going to try to get you back on the phone for a couple minutes to explain it. But I think we can rest comfortably that that's not likely to happen. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on, and I hope every one of the listeners out there have enjoyed this session as well. It's easy to follow you. You're on Twitter at Allan Lichtman is your handle. So that's double
Yes,
L, Allan Lichtman. And of course, your book is Predicting the Next President, The Keys to the White House. The 2020 edition is available on Amazon. And Allan, thank you so much.
It was my pleasure, and I'm happy to speak to you again. You know where to find me.
We know where to find you. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll be taking a look at this week's Luckbox long shot trade. It's a new segment. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Suggested to us by James Rudder on Twitter, we're going to try out a new segment today. It's called the Luckbox Long Shot. And unlike our usual Luckbox lockbox trades, which are high-priced, high-probability trades, long shots are priced very low with plenty of room to grow. Our inaugural Luckbox long shot trade comes directly from next week's guest, neuroscientist, prediction market trader, super trader, and a great friend of the political trade, Jason Pipkin. We asked Jason for a long shot play to introduce our Luckbox long shot, and he came up with the following market. What percentage of presidential votes will not be for the two major parties? It's a market unpredicted. It has 13 brackets from B1 to B13. They're priced about 0.5% increments. So B1, the first bracket, is 0.5% or less, and then B2 would be 0.5% to 1%, all the way up to B13, bracket number 13, which is 6% or more. So again, the question is what percentage of presidential vote will not be for the two major parties? So that's basically looking towards the Green Party and looking towards the Libertarian Party. And of course, last general election, Gary Johnson received almost 5 million total votes and 3.27% of the national vote, coming third in the nation and setting a record for the Libertarian Party's best ever electoral result in the process. In terms of the Libertarian Party's electoral history, he bested at Clark's previous record-setting 1% of the total vote in the 1980 presidential election. So we lean to Jason for this long shot, and he has a trade for us. The long shot trade is B2, the second bracket. That's 0.5% to 1%. And he offered the following explanation. It's priced at 10% or 10 cents. So clearly we have a 9-to-1 payout here, and it's a very attractive as a long shot. Elections with incumbents tend to feature lower third-party voting, which we have right now, an incumbent election. And currently, two-party share of the vote in polling is near where it was for the last two incumbent elections in 2004 and 2012. And while the Libertarian candidate Joe Jorgensen and the Green candidate Howie Hawkins are unknowns, and Kanye is barely on the ballot in any states that matter, it looks as though that vote total will likely come in. It certainly reconciles well with what Professor Lichtman just told us about not having any major third-party candidates to be considered a factor as one of his keys in the upcoming election. But it just hasn't happened in recent history where less than 5% was a total. Less than 2% is a very good bet. If you were to buy all those tranches that are below 2%, that would be worth as much as 75 cents. But if you want a pure long shot, in the words of Jason Pickman, go for 0.5% to 1%. That's a B2. It's a big payout at its current 10-cent price. And remember, you can sell this whenever you want to. It's not a forecast of the outcome. It's just a wager. So at 10 cents, it looks good. And there's a lot of opportunity to sell to the upside. So that is our first Luckbox long shot sent in to us by Jason Pipkin. And of course, Jason's going to be on the show with us next week. So we look forward to having him. That's going to wrap up today's episode. Thanks for tuning in to The Political Trade, and tell your friends about us and make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, check out thepoliticaltrade.com to sign up for our newsletter, find us on social media, or send us a message. It's all at thepoliticaltrade.com. So thanks again for joining us today. This is Jeff Joseph.
And I'm Mike Reddy.
And remember to believe in math, master your trade, and join us next time on The Political Trade.